So my name is Ryu, and I guess just to introduce myself for those of you who are less familiar with me, I haven't been around the Interval Center very much. I've been here participating in, assisting, and helping lead the circling labs that we hold every twice a week. Every week here we do circling for 3 hours from noon to 3 every day, or those twice during those time periods. And I've been on staff for a lot of the T3 trainings, Alethea, things like that. And also I lead a Circling Fundamentals 7-week class that I started actually teaching in this room with this whiteboard. So yeah, shall we get started?
Yes.
Cool. So I'm going to talk about kind of perception and why perception is, I think, one of the easiest ways to understand circling is to look at it as an issue of what can we perceive in someone's experience and what can't we perceive in someone's experience. So before I go straight into perception, I want to talk a bit about why I came to this conclusion. And everybody here has different ways they're cutting the practice, different ways they're, it's like if you imagine it's like a non-dual experience and they're cutting out maps of how to organize that and orient to it. So I'm going to talk about why I'm orienting to it this way and why I'm cutting things this way first. So I've been in a lot of trainings where we tend to do something like give people who are starting to learn how to circle like lists of things. Like we might give someone a list of something like, here's a number of good things to say in a circle. Like we might want to check like, you seem, or I seem, or we seem, or...
So this is what you've been told?
Yeah, well, this is what I've been with in the trainings. And so we've given people these lists of like, here's a good list number of things to remember in a circle, or to do in a circle, or to say in a circle. Right? And they don't, my experience is it hasn't been very fruitful. And so I'm looking at this and I'm looking at kind of these lists and I'm going, if we can figure out like what is the process, like what is the awareness or the kind of thought process that actually generates this list. And if we can figure out the thought process that actually generates that list, then the list becomes obsolete. Because we can just give people, if we can just get people oriented in the process, we don't need the list anymore. So there's actually, what I found is we can actually find the process. And this here is a product. Excuse my handwriting. So that's a product of that process. And if we can just give people access to the process, it's much easier than trying to point people to the process through giving them lists of these different things to say or different things to orient to. And so I look at this ability to circle as a whole as a collection of processes. And they're all running simultaneously. And some of them are layered, some of them combine processes. And so for example, let's see. I think we'll get into that more when we get into the content. But what I've done here is kind of recognizing this and seeing this, and after trying to kind of categorize what are all the processes that are happening in circling, right? I've actually done my best to kind of order them out from the least complex processes to the most complex processes. Right? Where the least complex processes don't build on any of the other processes that are there. And the most complex processes build on all the previous processes. They include and transcend. Transcend and include all those previous processes. So what happens when we kind of line everything up like this, I found, is that we could actually, right now I'm learning how to meditate from a teacher, I believe it's the Theravada Buddhist tradition. And they have an idea in their practice of like what she's doing is she's giving it a practice. Like we start with concentration practice. And then once I did concentration practice, the next thing she did was, okay, now that you've done that, it's time to move on to Vipassana practice. Right? And so in their main meditation models, there's like this idea of like stages of practice, that each practice builds on the next practice, or each practice leads to the next practice. And that next practice builds on whatever quality of awareness or consciousness that was cultivated by the previous practice. So I think we can do because we can do my theory is that we can organize things like this, and we can actually give people stages of practice in circling. And we can actually create kind of a path. We can create stages of practice, right? And we can kind of create a path or a staircase to a form of awakening or a form of realization. And so my understanding of what this realization is limited both by the youth of this practice and also by my own personal limitations. But I think that if we're kind of to start to describe what that is, I imagine it would be something along the lines of, in any moment, in any interaction, to be able to do the thing, like to be aware of everything that's happening. And from a place of being able to be aware of all that, to choose to do the thing that would create more connection. And to have choice around that, conscious choice, whether or not to do that. And that's a lot easier said than done. So why did I come across this idea of perceiving or perception? So I sat in a lot of circles in trainings where the circle would go something like this. So we're training someone who's new at facilitating circles. And they're in a training circle and they're facilitating the circling. And it would go something like, so what are you feeling? And the circle would be like, oh, I feel sad, I feel kind of stuck. Yeah. And the circle or the facilitator training would be like, oh, so you feel sad and stuck. Is that right? I'm like, yeah, I do. Cool. Now what? Right? And they would turn to the trainer, like, I'm lost, like, what am I? So, like, I've seen, like, numerous versions of this kind of happen. And kind of the ways in which we try to be like, oh, well, when you're at this place, you should have said this. Or when you're at this place, like, you didn't notice this. And see it not integrate for that person. And so I was like, well, what we need to be doing is like, it's not that they don't know what to say. It's that they don't actually see, it doesn't even occur to them that it exists. And so they don't even see that. They don't even get that. You can ask, like, oh, sad and stuck, how? Is it like a grieving? Is it like a loneliness? Is it like a shamefulness? Right. And at the same time, I was reading, we're going to do a presentation around 3 o'clock for the second breakout. I'm going to be talking with Rob McNamara, who studies development and teaches about developmental psychology. But in developmental psychology, there's this idea that we can't actually hold others. We only hold others to the degree of complexity that we hold ourselves. So the circle leader, the facilitator, who doesn't, it doesn't occur to them to ask, like, sad, like, in what kind of way sad? Like, it doesn't occur to them that that's like something that they can ask. So that they can't actually orient to the depth, the complexity of that person's experience. And without that, that's never going to occur to them to inquire about that. So that it dawned on me that, like, they don't perceive that complexity. They're not oriented to that complexity, and because they can't perceive it, it limits their ability to circle. And so I really started looking at, like, can we really look at this as an issue of, like, what someone can and can't perceive, rather than trying to tell them, like, what are the steps or what are the things? Can we actually work with the awareness itself and get them to hold that complexity, hold themselves with that complexity, so that naturally they're holding whatever someone they're relating to them as though they have that complexity, right? And so I really look at circling as a whole as this issue of, like, with how much complexity, with how much depth can I hold someone's experience? Does that make sense so far? So in my mind, there's a progression. So there's our development or our self-complexity. Right? Which gives rise to our ability to perceive something about someone else's experience. And from the ability to perceive it, we can actually inquire about it. And because we can inquire about it, we can actually gain agreement on it. And the more we have agreement on it, the more we create a shared space, the more we create an us, a we. So the issue again then is, it's like, if I don't actually hold someone's experience with having that depth, I'm never gonna notice that about their experience, right? And it's never gonna occur to me to actually ask them about that. And because we're never gonna ask them about it, or I'm never gonna ask them about it, I'm never gonna actually get to talk with them about that. So if I don't actually get like sad, like, oh, and it's not just like the word you're using, sad, isn't actually the thing. There's a whole universe, there's a whole experience happening that you're trying to communicate. And it's giving us like a general direction, right? But that word isn't the whole thing. There's actually this whole universe happening. And if I can't actually orient to that, it's never going to occur to me to ask, like, oh, sad, you're grieving about something, is that right? And it's not just a grieving, it's like a grieving of maybe something that you wish you had with someone, but it never had like, the opportunity to fully blossom. And getting that nuance, getting that depth, there's more actual contact between my understanding of what's happening for them and their world, right? Rather than just getting, oh, so you're sad, cool, now what?
What if you just can't reach that level more because you don't have that complexity built into your experience yet?
So that's where, next.
That was the case.
So that's where what comes into play are what I consider to be the preliminary practices of circling. Right. So in meditation, there's the idea that there are preliminary practices that there are practices that I'm actually not that familiar with. Cool. You can help me out. There's the idea that there are preliminary practices that prime our awareness so that we can actually do the full meditation. And so I have 4 practices that I think are the preliminary practices of circling that we do to integrate, to cultivate this capacity for perceiving, so that when we sit in a circle, we don't put ourselves in that situation where we're like, okay, so you're feeling this, I get that you're feeling that. Now what? Because if that were the case, then we'd be done, right? If the word was the thing, then we're done. We don't have anything more to get about the world we've already got. Does that make sense so far?
Am I right to hear that you're delivering this information from the perspective of the trainer, the facilitator, the person that the circler, or anyone else, but the circler has as much opportunity. The circle has as much opportunity to bring this into the circling as the facilitator does.
Absolutely. And I actually view, so I'll clue you into a bit about how I'm organizing these stages. I actually view like once we do the preliminary practices, we learn how to hold the role of the circler, and we learn how to hold the role of the circlee. Right? And the circle is the role of, like, I learn how to integrate my vulnerability so I can share it in any moment. And the role of the circler is that I learn how to put aside or welcome whatever I'm experiencing long enough that I can put it aside to be with someone so that I can invite them to be vulnerable. And then when we can integrate those 2 roles, we move into what I haven't integrated yet, but that's my assessment. But we move into like organic circles, where there isn't one person where the attention is on, right, beforehand, which I think makes it even more challenging, because then I, as a participant, I have to have access to both of those at the same time to be able to choose what actually, is it me revealing myself more, or is it being with you more, that's going to create an opportunity for everything to be here. And so there's a process I see happening, and I imagine it makes sense to me to organize things that way. Because I think I would argue that organic circling is probably far more complex than our standard circles. So I'm going to talk about the practices that I consider to be preliminary. And they have to do with the fundamental ways that we get information about someone's experience in a circle. And that we're able to actually perceive the distinctness or the depth of someone's experience through those means. So it's like I can get information, but what's important isn't just that I get the information, but I actually can orient to that complexity of like there's a whole universe that's happening. So we're going to talk about here about how we get information about the circlees. Well, if I'm a facilitator and I'm circling someone, how do we get information about their experience? And let's see how I'll do this. I'll do it this way. So we have our facilitator and our circling. And so, yeah, I think I said that. I'll do that. There were 3 primary ways. So the first one is verbal. We get information about people's experience through verbal means. So it's really a simple one. I might ask Pat. So if you notice your experience, what's kind of most apparent to you, or what do you feel right now?
Actually, forward-leaning, coaxing or accepting of anticipation.
Cool. So anticipation, like forward-leaning, kind of wanting to take things in. So if I got information verbally by asking her what it is, what she finds in her experience. So that's really straightforward. It's not any more complicated than that. That's one way we can get information about someone's experience. So that correlates to, so I'll mark that off here. So the other way that we can get information about someone's experience is through their nonverbal expression. So this has to do with how they're holding themselves, how they're expressing themselves. What's the tone of voice they're using? What's the speed at which they're talking? Right? Are they more kind of upright and centered, or are they more collapsed? Or maybe if you have to look at my eyes, are they more engaged, outward? Or are they way inward, inside of themselves? You'll actually feel like they're out there, like we're here with you. So we can get very subtle, if we really pay attention, we get very subtle information about potentially that correlates to their internal experience from how they're presenting themselves. And a lot of the somatic therapies would argue that the body is actually the subconscious. And so all the subconscious is being held, stored in our presentation of ourselves, our kind of energetic presentation. And the third way that we get information is through the impact. So that has to do with my response. So it feels different sitting across from one person as it does from another person. And if I can maybe articulate what it is that's different, I might actually get about how you're being, such that it actually feels different. really short time. I usually take 6 hours to go through all the preliminary practices. We're probably only going to be able to I'm probably going to be able to invite you to try out one of them today. But, so what's beautiful for me about this is that, first of all, there's a very clear divide between content and context. Right? Whereas content might be the words I'm speaking to you right now, and if I were to type up the words I'm speaking to you in an email and send them to you, and you read it, that would be the content right now. The context would be more of like, if I were like a foreigner on some television program, and you didn't know what I was, you didn't understand actually the words I was saying. You'd have to go with everything else other than the actual words to understand how I might be being, or what I might be feeling, or what I might be trying to convey. So that would be more context. And the context tends to generate content. I will argue. I won't get too much into that, how that works, because that again becomes a really complex subject. But what I like about this model, so we have the verbal, which is the content, and then the impact and the nonverbal expression, which is the context. And so what I really like about this is that it balances our perception. It actually works with the way we're paying attention to the moment. And it says what we need to do. I'm going to kind of draw on top of this thing here, but basically it says we need to equally balance our attention on the verbal, on the nonverbal, and on the impact at the same time. And if I can't actually hold all of those three things simultaneously, I'm going to miss out on potentially very valuable information about someone's experience. So what people often tend to do, especially who are starting out or going through a lot of our trainings here, is that they tend to bias the verbal. They tend to move entirely towards the verbal, and it becomes a dialoguing process, which I will argue that the circle is not. Right? It's about noticing what it's like to be with someone. And that includes the context of how they're being and how they're showing up. So having this clarity around what you need to pay attention to and what you don't need to pay attention to. Like you don't need to pay attention to the window. Right? It gives us a focus of our attention and then invites us to balance our attention across those three awarenesses and to hold them at the same time so we don't miss anything. Now, still with me? Cool. So let's actually get into doing something before we run out of time. So, so with all three of these, like I said, it's important again that we can actually orient to the complexity of someone's experience. Right? So it's fine, I might be able to get verbal content from someone. I might be able to notice the impact, I might be able to notice their expression, but if I can't actually can't use that to orient more and more to the nuances of their experience, the richness and the texture of their experience, it's not really going to be useful. So there's a key principle here, I'll argue is a key principle that is the bottom here. That contrast illuminates distinctness. So it's like I have two people and they both claim that they're having an experience of sadness. Are they having exactly the same experience? Probably not. And if I want to get someone's world, it means I want to get the uniqueness of their experience, right? The distinctness of what it's like to be uniquely who they are, and uniquely have that experience of sadness based off of who they are and how they relate to that, their history, whatever that is. So if I can actually bring contrast, if I can actually go, are you sad, lonely, or are you sad, grieving? Then it actually invites us to get more and more nuance of that person's experience. And that allows us to have more and more contact with the complexity, and more of that complexity of the experience that they're having. So there's ways of bringing contrast into all three of these that invites someone into being in contact with the complexity of their experience, and us actually getting that with them. So, I'm going to share with you what I think is the second of the four, what I argue are the four preliminary practices. And what we're going to do is we're going to break up into dyads. And one person is we're going to take turns. So, let's say with you, Josh. Right, so, let's see, this is the NVC, feelings, emotions, wordless.
I was waiting for it to come out.
Yeah. So let's say that I'll take a turn. So I'm going to first do it with you. Right? And so this is a practice of through the verbal means of communication, of getting into or inviting someone into more complexity in their experience. So I'm going to be the circle, or you're going to be the circlet. And so I'm going to invite you first. Don't tell me what it is, but just choose a word on there.
Random?
Yeah, or you might like one. Just don't choose one that's your actual experience. Cool. So I'm going to go, how are you feeling, Josh? And you can add that word.
I feel dazzled.
You feel dazzled. Cool. So what I'm going to do then is I'm actually going to use contrast to invite more distinctness into that experience. So the key that opens up contrast through verbal means is the phrase, in what kind of way? Another way to put it would be, what's his version of? So, dazzled in what kind of way? Or what's his version of dazzled? And it's going to invite me if I go, okay, so what would that be? And I'm not actually going to ask you. This is a key point. I'm going to actually do it within myself and generate contrast and offer it to you. So I'm going to go, what are the ways someone could be dazzled? Right? Is it dazzled, like, just kind of like awestruck and just kind of like everything kind of goes blank? Or is it kind of dazzled, like almost like fascinated? Like, wow, like it's like so intriguing or engaging that I'm just kind of lost in it, dazzled. So I'm offering two versions of dazzle, and then I'm going to go, and is there something else? Or is it some other way for you? So this is going to invite, if we were actually circling, this would invite the circlee to have to contact their experience to get that information. So they're going to be more in contact with their experience, hopefully, unless they do something else with the inquiry. And it invites me to actually orient to the actual complexity of that experience without just being like, okay, cool, you're dazzled. I know what that is. And we don't actually get any more connection. Does that
The whole exercise.
make sense? Cool. So, and let's see. I think I'll just do it now because I forgot to say this at the beginning, but I have, let's see. So yeah, so I am, I forgot to do this at the beginning. I should have a disclaimer that these are just my opinions on circling, and I'm not trying to represent any of Authentic Worlds, or I've done most of my training with Authentic World, and I actually have trained at all with Guy, but I'm not trying to represent their opinions. They're just my opinions on the practice. So does all that make sense? So we would take turns. So you would choose a word, and then I would choose a word, and then you would choose a word, and we can just kind of go back for maybe 6 minutes or so.
Right.
So the exercise is the experiencing of myself, hearing a word and finding in myself, say, two ways that could be experienced, and bring those.
Yeah, I mean, you can.
So it's not the reply or response to that from the person.
Yeah, this is a practice of offering contrast, of being able to get contrast and really get that the word isn't the thing.
Gotcha.
Right. And so I was doing it, and you probably caught in that I was actually feeling into like, what would that be like, and kind of taking it on. You don't necessarily need to do that. You can do it whatever way works for you. But that's the idea, is that we generate that contrast so that we offer. And so, other thing I'll point out is that it becomes basically impossible to get stuck in a circle. And you can bring this, nearly, there are other things that we need to pay attention to. But if someone's actually contacting their experience, and it's really hard to get stuck, because you might be like, oh, what are you feeling? Nothing. Nothing in what kind of way? Is it like a blankness? Is it a numbness? Is it a void? Is it, right? So, we kind of, it resolves that problem. Is there anyone need any clarification or anything?
On the exercise, the person pretending to be the certainly is first choosing a word that actually doesn't represent their experience.
Right.
And second, not actually responding the second time.
Yeah.
It ends once you generate it.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. Cool, so we're uneven, so I'll be joining you. So find yourself sitting across from somebody, and if you want, I have copies of the feelings, emotion, words. Yeah. So if you want to take one, go ahead and find yourself sitting across from someone. Yeah.
Sure, why not? I have one question.
Yeah.
Can we just use our real feelings in the moment?
If you really want to.
There's a hesitancy.
Was there a reason that you?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
I think it's more challenging to create it out of scratch. And it's like,
the impact.
Right. So can I just actually address that for just a minute?
Yeah.
I actually have a BFA in Hollywood style like film production. I went to film school in California, of all things, which we taught pretty very good use right now. But one of the things we did was we wrote stories of characters, and I could only write stories about characters to the depth of complexity that I had in myself.
Sure.
So I look back at my stories and I'm just like, this character, like, I don't even no idea like what vulnerability is, and like, no one's gonna identify with characters and vulnerable in any kind of way. So I think it's really valuable, like the reason I do it like this and then eventually move it into actually working with the actual feelings is because I think it's really, I value like being able to generate that, like the challenge of being able to generate that from scratch and generate that complexity of the being from scratch. So, how are you doing?
I really appreciated that. I thought that was really interesting, and I also appreciated one thing that Josh did when, if I look, instead of like giving different kind of complexities of that emotion, he asked me if I was kind of going out with it or coming back in. And I was like, oh yeah, I can do that with emotions. I really appreciated that. Like that kind of complexity also.
Right.
So that's what's going on for me is that there's a little complexity to the questions we ask to certainly with the information we're reading, with what we're hearing.
Yes.
Well, say that again, sorry.
Just there's like in your own questioning techniques that that's even a skill to develop. Just how connected you are with the questioning and with the questions that are going to maintain the connection. Like it worked for you. You like that you went that route. You know, like what if there's a question that doesn't resonate with the circle? Like then you find yourself disconnected there.
Right.
So it's like a reading of what will keep connection.
Yeah, like what I'll say is that, a while back I did this and someone was like, well, why aren't you asking them, like, why do you feel sad, or why? And it leaves too much of a window, in my opinion, for someone to go up into abstraction and talk about. So there's actually an awareness that's happening, where we're actually, when we ask a question like this, we're actually asking someone to go into their body and actually feel what's true, and to come back with the information from that place, not just as an abstraction, right? And so if we ask, like, why are you feeling this way, or why is it that way, we tend to get a mental abstraction back, which doesn't actually have them more in their experience, and we don't get to experience being with them in their experience more. So yeah, so that, like, being able to hold that complexity seems really relevant to actually noting like how we're actually impacting, how the question actually impacts somebody and the effect it has.
I like it just because it's an exercise in honing my own skills at being detailed with my own complexity. So that just translates into being much better.
Right. So I did this, I offered the second practice today because it's more attractive. And the first practice is to be able to do it with yourself. Right? To feel into my system, my body, and find something that's actually there, that's apparent, and hold it in my awareness, and allow it to be there, and you go, oh, is it more like, it's like, okay, so it's like feels like maybe dense. Is it more like a heavy dense? Is it like a collapsed dense? Like how is that? What does that mean? Is it like a sadness? And we can do it the same, like we can, just like I described, we kind of did it with emotion words, we can do the same thing with sensation words. Like, is it moving? Is it quivering? Is it like a quivering? Is it more almost like it could be shaking when it's really big, or is it you can really fine, like tremble, almost like a humming? So we can continually forever get more and more detail. And what's interesting about circling is we have this notion of weaving shared reality, that we can get more and more agreement. Right? That we can agree about sadness, and then we can agree about grieving. Right? That's the sadness of kind of grieving. And so implicit in that form is this notion of complexity, that we're not done. We just, okay, cool, you're sad. Implicit in that is that there's actually more. There's always more to get. And maybe the communication will never hold the entirety of that person's experience, but we can actually get, at least get more and more specific about what that person's feeling. And we can be in connection in that way. And like the same T3 fingers may never actually touch. So we've got 5 minutes, so thinking at end about here. So if you were to continue going, I'll give you So if we were to continue going, what we would do is we would actually create a thread. So rather than just choosing one and then giving one contrast, we would keep doing it. So someone choose a word.
Bashful.
So is it like bashful, like shy and really like kind of timid, or is it like bashful, like really embarrassed? Maybe there's like a lot of like your face is really red and there's like, and you might actually enjoy it a bit. So go ahead and choose one.
Embarrassed.
Embarrassed. Okay. And so I'm going to go bashful, embarrassed. In what kind of way? So this is where it does get challenging. So do you like? So I said there was like enjoyment in like the embarrassing, or yeah. So embarrassed, like bashful, embarrassed. Kind of, there's a bit of enjoyment. It's like, is it enjoyment because you know that like you feel cared for, or you actually feel comfortable or seen in the embarrassment, or maybe you're just like feeling the aliveness of that, or kind of how that feels in you. Okay. And so we could keep going like this. It's really hard to do when there's not actually an actual thing that we're focusing on, because usually in circles when we get a certain amount of contact, it shifts into something else, or folds into something else. Right. So
I think that's a very funny challenge on the circle today. Yeah.
It also would be more challenging on these kinds of words than it would be where you actually have some context.
Yes. Yeah. So the invitation first is the challenge to hold that. And it's the continual, it's like getting all those details and being in contact and be like, so I'm really getting that you're bashful, that you're embarrassed, but you actually enjoy it, and you actually enjoy this about it, and getting all of that nuance has us just that much more in contact, right? And I'm less and less likely to just project, oh cool, embarrassed. I know what that is. And we're not actually in connection with my idea about how you're being, rather than how you actually are.
It seems like we got a part of your model.
Yes.
I want to see the rest of the model. How would I go about seeing that?
How do you go about seeing
Is it available?
Is it available? I'm working on making it available, and I'm working on putting together some kind of training where we actually work on going through the practices one at a time and actually integrating them one at a time. Because really circling, like, you need to be able to do all this to single circle and circle. And so, yeah. Yeah, so in my mind, like, these are the things that we need to be able to do before we circle. And so circling is actually pretty complex already. So I really want people to be, I think it's really confusing to throw people into a circle and to tell them to circle. It's much easier to have them integrate these awarenesses one at a time. So I really want to work on creating a process. What's that?
I would take that.
Cool.
You offered online.
Live streaming. Well, the cartographer and engineer and me really loved your graphs that you were graphing on the first whiteboard.
Yeah.
Like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I really think it's helpful to make it as explicit as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get explicit, we don't deal with people sitting in circles like, what am I supposed to be paying attention to right now or doing? It's like the same thing as killing someone in a room and being like, go ahead and meditate. So
to get a sense, this part, how we get info, 1, 2, 3, is this one module, or is this does everything else kind of unfold under this? Because it seems like we went into verbal.
these are, I'll spill a little of the beans. So this is, these are the preliminary practices. And this expands out into a 3 or 4 layer diagram of everything that we need to be able to perceive in a circle in order to be able to hold someone through this in this kind of a way. So for example, in T3 we talked about dissonance. Right? So there's hi, I'm really glad to meet you. I'm really excited to meet you. Hi, I'm really glad to meet you. Really excited. Right? And so in order for you to notice the dissonance, you actually have to be able to notice the verbal and then the context, the non-verbal impact at the same time and compare the information against each other. And then you get even more complex information. And then you can share that, and that's going to invite even more richness about what's actually going on here. So the model kind of builds out this way. And these are the ABCs, these are the scales, these are the things that we need to be able to it's like the fundamental things we need to be able to perceive that ground everything else, and all the complexity that builds off of it.